The Miami Dolphins end yet another NFL season with a ton of disappointment and a lot of questions heading into their next offseason as a franchise. And 2023 was supposed to be the year for the Dolphins. They've really spent the last 6 years rebuilding this team and getting to this moment where they got rid of a lot of young players for draft capital and built their team into having multiple star players on both sides of the ball. You know, with the likes of Tyreek Hill, who they traded for 2 off seasons ago, Bradley Chubb, Jalen Ramsey, all of the star talent they accumulated in a couple of off seasons. It finally looked like on paper this Miami Dolphins team was ready to be a true contender in the AFC and actually have a chance to win their first playoff game since the 2000 season. And things actually started pretty good for the Dolphins, as it did last year when they started 3-0. The Dolphins started this season 5-1, including multiple blowout victories, including a 70-20 win over the Denver Broncos in week number 3. And their offense looked like one of the best we have seen in recent memory. Tua Tagovailoa was on an MVP pace through the first month or 2 of the season. Raheem Mostert, Devon Achane, the double-headed monster of their running backs, had one of the top rushing attacks in the league as well, so they had 2 stud running backs. And then of course they had Tyreek Hill, who was on pace for 2,000 yards for most of the season. Jalen Waddle as their wide receiver 2 went over 1,000 yards for his 3rd straight season. And it looked like head coach Mike McDaniel found some adjustments for the Dolphins season collapse in 2022 and found a nice counterpunch to what defenses were throwing off about this offense from just a season ago. But I think in week number 7 is when we really began to see what this Dolphins team truly was. And although it wasn't super apparent at the time, as the season went on, I think we started to actually learn that the Dolphins were a good team, but not one of the true contenders. And that week 7 matchup was against the Philadelphia Eagles at Philadelphia on Sunday Night Football. And the Dolphins ended up losing that game by 14 points. And oftentimes throughout that game, they just looked a little bit overmatched, especially in the trenches. But I wanted to wait and see how the Dolphins performed 2 weeks later against the former Super Bowl champions, the Kansas City Chiefs. This game was in Germany, kind of a neutral site. And once again, the Dolphins offense just looked super lackluster against one of the better teams and better defenses in the league. They scored 0 points in 3 quarters. And to give them a little bit of credit, they did almost pull off a miraculous comeback down 21-0. And the offense was unable to put together a final drive to tie up the game and send it into overtime. So naturally, going with the theme of the Dolphins season, their next 3 games were against inferior opponents and the Las Vegas Raiders, the New York Jets, and the Washington Commanders. And all 3 of those teams basically got blown out. The Dolphins moved to 9-3. And there was a lot of people in the media talking about the Dolphins being a legit Super Bowl team and somebody that can challenge the Ravens and the Chiefs. But as someone who has kept close attention to these Dolphins the past couple of seasons, it seems like every year once they get into these pressure moments in December and January, the team really fails to rise to the occasion. And we saw that exact same thing this year on Monday Night Football against the Tennessee Titans. The Dolphins came into the game as a 2-touchdown favorite. Vegas was looking at it like, hey man, every single bad team the Dolphins have played this year, they've destroyed. And the Titans rolled into Miami with a 4-8 record, so seemingly the Dolphins were supposed to dominate this game. And things ultimately just kind of got weird. It was 10-7 at halftime, the Titans had the lead, and then the Titans down the stretch of that game basically self-destructed. They gave the Dolphins practically 2 touchdowns with 2 fumbles, and the Dolphins were up 27-13 with around 4 minutes to go in the game. But in miraculous fashion, the Titans drove all the way down the field, scored the touchdown, got the 2-point conversion. The Dolphins got the ball back, they went 3 and out. The Titans got the ball back once again, and then with their rookie quarterback leading them down the field, they scored another touchdown, basically walked it off, and the Titans had one of the most amazing comeback victories that we've seen in quite some time. But something that happened in this game is kind of where I want to bring this video and this topic, and that is when Tyreek Hill went out, how the Dolphins offense looked. Tyreek was rolled up on in the first half by a Titans cornerback, and you could tell right away it was a severe ankle sprain. He was not going to be able to return, and if he was going to be able to play, he was not going to be 100% healthy and be able to be as effective as he normally is. And the Dolphins offense really struggled to get things going and go against a Titans defense that is pretty middle of the pack. And that was the first time this season that I looked at Tyreek Hill as the MVP of the Dolphins and Tua Tagovailoa as a limited player that's probably being propped up by some of the best weaponry and coaching in the entire league. But I wanted to see how this team responded. They showed up next week at home and defeated another pretty bad team in the New York Jets, once again 30-0. And then they had a showdown on Christmas Eve against the Dallas Cowboys. And funny enough, I feel like the Cowboys and the Dolphins are very similar teams. They have very similar histories in the past few decades, and their quarterbacks and their rosters are pretty similar in my opinion as well. I think Dak Prescott and Tua are pretty comparable players. So going into that game, I was very curious to see which one of them would break the fraud allegations, because many NFL fans were calling this the Fraud Bowl going into it, and the Dolphins were actually able to squeak out a victory 22-20 against the Cowboys, but it was not easy. The Dolphins needed a game-winning drive and a walk-off field goal from Jason Sanders to get the job done, and the offense once again was only able to score one touchdown against this Cowboys defense, which we've seen now is not super good. So the Dolphins headed into the last 2 weeks of the season where if they won out, they were going to be the #1 seed in the AFC, and if they just won one of the two, they would be AFC East champions for the first time since 2008. They would be the #2 seed in the playoffs, host at least one playoff game, and really have their best season in over 2 decades. And the game against Baltimore was hyped up to be one of the games of the week, and they got absolutely destroyed by Baltimore. 56-19, the game was never really close outside of the first quarter, and that was another game where I really feel like you could tell the difference between the two quarterbacks and Lamar Jackson and Tua, and what it looks like to have an elite guy and a guy that is just pretty solid and a mid-tier quarterback. I think it's fair to criticize the Dolphins defense because anytime your defense allows 56 points in a game, you're really not going to win. But my counterpoint to that is how many times do you see players like Lamar Jackson, like Josh Allen, like Patrick Mahomes lose games by over 35 points? I don't know this for a fact, but I'm pretty confident in saying that I don't think Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson has lost a game by that many points. And people may say, hey, that's a team stat, you really can't put that all on the quarterback. But if you're an elite quarterback like Mahomes, like an Allen, like a Lamar, you're going to keep the game at least competitive because you're going to be able to put up yards and points yourself. And Tua was unable to do that consistently against this Ravens defense. So now their backs were against the wall in week 18 against the Buffalo Bills, their division rival. And once again, the offense and Tua struggled mightily. Tua only passed for 173 yards. He had 2 interceptions, one on the final drive of the game when the Dolphins needed him to go down the field and score a touchdown. And it was just one of those games when you watch Josh Allen on one sideline and one side of the field, and then Tua Tagovailoa on one sideline and one side of the field. They just did not look like comparable and comparable quarterbacks, and it made you think, do the Dolphins even have a chance to win this division with Tua as quarterback when you're going to be going against Josh Allen 2 times a year? So with that loss, the Dolphins fell to the #6 seed, which means they had to go on the road in Arrowhead against the Kansas City Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes for a rematch. And very quickly, this did not look like a good spot for the Dolphins to be in, mainly because of the weather. It was going to be -30 wind chill in Kansas City, and the Dolphins, and especially Tua, do not play good in the cold weather. There was a stat like their last 10 games in sub 40-degree weather, they're 0-10, and yeah, this was pretty much another one of those games where they just got absolutely pummeled. They lost 26-7, and the Dolphins did have a lot of injuries on defense, which definitely impacted this game. For any Dolphins fan out there that wants to argue we would have won this game without any injuries, I really don't believe that. The offense only scored 7 points. Tua did not look comfortable. He was unable to complete passes deep down the field in the cold weather. And again, as I've mentioned, these last 3 games for the Dolphins were very, very telling. Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, and Patrick Mahomes. Tua did not look anywhere close to their universe as a player, and the majority of people understood that in terms of their talent level. I mean, it's well known Tua is not the biggest guy. He doesn't have the biggest arm. He can't move around super well, but I personally thought that there was a pathway for him to be like a Drew Brees pocket passer who could just dissect defenses and still be an elite passer and player. But after this final stretch of the season, I do not know where the Dolphins should go with Tua. He's going to be one of the bigger topics of discussions offseason if the Dolphins should pay him a long-term deal, or if they should draft somebody, if they should trade Tua and maybe go after somebody like Justin Fields. The Dolphins are going to have a lot of options, but it's going to come down to the organization self-reflecting and really thinking about, hey, can Tua go head-to-head against Mahomes, against Allen, against Stroud, against Lamar? Those are just some of the stud quarterbacks in the AFC. I'm not even mentioning Joe Burrow or Justin Herbert, who didn't make the playoffs this year. Tua is more likely than not going to have to go in frigid temperatures and play against these star quarterbacks. I don't know how the Dolphins organization looks at Tua and looks at all these other quarterbacks in the same conference as them and views him as somebody that can get the team over the hump and to a Super Bowl. But the interesting discussion is, how do the Dolphins improve off of the position? Because Tua isn't a bad player, but he's just not an elite one. So do you sign him just to have some stability as a franchise, just to be able to make the playoffs every single year, or at least every once in a while, kind of like the Dallas Cowboys with Dak, or kind of like the Minnesota Vikings with Kirk Cousins, those similar type of quarterbacks and teams? Or do you try and hit a home run and actually try and find a superstar talent to match up with the other beast of the AFC? Is Justin Fields the answer? Can he develop enough enough as a passer to become a legit elite quarterback in the league? Is there somebody in the draft that you really want to target, maybe trade up for? Is it Jaden Daniels? Would a team trade down where you can move up and get him? I don't know, but the Dolphins are in a weird spot, and we kind of call this quarterback purgatory. But the problem is you can do a lot worse than Tua, and we've seen over the past 2 decades that the Dolphins have done a lot worse than Tua. They've cycled through so many quarterbacks. Their last long-term option was Ryan Tannehill, and I do believe that Tua is a better player than Tannehill, but the problem is Tua is closer to Tannehill's level than he is to Allen's and Mahomes and Lamar's, and that is the problem with Tua, and that is the problem with the Dolphins, and that is something that they're going to have to answer this offseason, what they're going to do long-term with the quarterback. Personally, what I would do if I were the Miami Dolphins is let Tua play out on his 5th-year extension. Do not extend him, do not pay him a cent, do not give him multiple new years on his deal. Let him play this year out and then reevaluate things at the end of the season. If Tua balls out and proves he can win big games and win in bad conditions against these top quarterbacks, then you feel a lot more comfortable in paying him a long-term deal. And if not, you can't come to an agreement on an extension, you have him on the franchise tag for the next 2 seasons. But let's say the season goes bad, the Dolphins underperform, maybe miss the playoffs, then you have a pretty decent pick where you can trade up or maybe go after one of the top quarterbacks in the draft. But really my point is the Dolphins do not have to rush themselves into a long-term deal with Tua, and it actually does not make sense at all to do that. Let it play out on the 5th year, let things materialize themselves, and you'll get a clearer picture next year on what to do and what other options that you have at the quarterback position. But it's going to be very interesting what the Miami Dolphins organization and GM Chris Grier do regarding Tua this offseason. But I want to know what you think about the Miami Dolphins and Tua and what you would do regarding his extension. Do you agree with me and think that they should just write him out on the 5th year and look for other options to continue to improve the position? Or do you think Tua is the answer long-term and the Dolphins should extend him as soon as they can? Subscribe to the channel if you are new, drop a like on the video if you did enjoy it, and as always, thank you guys so much for watching the video, and I'll catch you guys in my next one.